The last good day smelled of fresh water and gasoline, a sailor's perfume. Liam Hayes, a man who understood the world through its strata and pressures, believed in preparation. He moved about the deck of the Stargazer, his 38-foot Catalina, with an economy of motion that was both practiced and reverent. He was a geology professor, but on the water he was a different kind of scholar, reading the language of wind speed indicators and the subtle shifts in the lake's turquoise skin. He checked the tension on the jib sheets, coiled the main halyard into a perfect concentric circle, and ran a callous thumb along the cotter pin of the anchor shackle. Nothing was left to chance. Competence was his religion, and safety its primary ritual. He had taught this to his students in lecture halls, the slow, inexorable forces that shaped mountains, and he taught it now to his daughter. "Okay, Captain Maya," he said, his voice a low rumble against the gentle lapping of water against the hull. "What's this knot called?" Maya, 6 years old with her mother's dark, serious eyes and his own unruly blonde hair, peered at the figure-8 follow-through he'd tied to a cleat. She scrunched her nose in concentration, a gesture that always made Liam's heart ache with a fierce, protective love. The strong one?" Liam chuckled, a warm sound that was absorbed by the vast open space around them. "That's right, it's the strong one. A bowline is the king of knots, but this one will never, ever come undone by itself. You can trust it." He tapped her on the nose. "It's about trust, see? We trust the boat. We trust our knots. We trust the weather report." Their bond was a thing of quiet, shared moments. It was in the way she handed him tools from the locker, knowing a Phillips from a flathead. It was in the way he'd point to the distant, hazy shoreline of Wisconsin and explain the glacial scouring that had carved this inland sea millions of years ago, and she would listen, rapt, as if he were telling the grandest of fairy tales. This trip, a 2-day jaunt from their home port in Saugatuck up to the Manitou Islands, was to be her graduation. She had her own miniature life vest, a vibrant orange that stood out against the deep blue of the lake, her name stenciled across the back in black permanent marker, Maya. An hour into their journey, with the sun high and the water placid, Maya stood at the helm, her small hands on the large stainless steel wheel. She wore Liam's oversized captain's hat, the brim flopping down over her eyes. Liam, seeing the perfect crystalline moment, pulled out his phone. He framed the shot. His daughter, the tiny captain, with the endless horizon of Lake Michigan stretching out behind her, a seemingly benevolent expanse of blue. He typed a quick message to his wife, Sarah, back home. "Captain Maya reporting for duty. All clear on the water." He hit send, the image rocketing through the ether, a digital ghost of a perfect memory. Back on land, in their quiet house filled with the scent of coffee and the low hum of the refrigerator, Sarah's phone chimed. She smiled, the image filling her screen. It was so quintessentially them. Liam, the patient teacher, and Maya, his adoring apprentice. She saved the photo, her heart swelling with a placid, everyday love. She felt no premonition, no cold finger of dread. It was just a picture from a boat on a Tuesday. She went about her day, watering the plants, answering emails, the image of her daughter in the big hat a warm coal in her mind. The change began subtly. A text to Liam in the early afternoon went unanswered. She rationalized it. They were probably out of cell range, a common occurrence on the lake. As evening approached, she turned on the Weather Channel. A severe thunderstorm warning was crawling across the screen, a jagged, angry smear of red and yellow moving fast out of the west. Her stomach tightened. Liam was meticulous. He would have seen this coming. He would have found a safe harbor. He always did. She called his phone. It went straight to voicemail. She called the boat's satellite phone, a piece of equipment he insisted on for emergencies. It rang and rang unanswered, each electronic burr a spike of acid in her gut. The sun began to set. painting the sky in lurid shades of orange and purple, a beautiful, cruel mockery of the storm that was now raging somewhere out on the water. The hours crawled by, each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall a hammer blow against her fraying composure. Rationalizations became a frantic litany in her head. The radio was damaged by lightning. They took shelter in a small, uninhabited cove. He's waiting for the storm to pass. He's just waiting. But the silence from the lake was absolute, a vast, suffocating void where her family should be. By 10 p.m., the storm had passed on the news radar, but the storm inside her was just beginning. By 11 p.m., the rationalizations had all died, leaving behind a cold, hard certainty. Something was terribly wrong. Her hand trembled as she picked up the phone. The numbers for the Coast Guard a blur through the tears she could no longer hold back. When the calm, professional voice of the operator answered, all she could manage was a choked sob. "My husband," she whispered, her voice a raw, unfamiliar thing. "My husband and my little girl. They're on the lake." The response was immediate and immense, an army assembling to fight a ghost. Before the sun had even crested the horizon, the placid post-storm waters of Lake Michigan were being sliced apart by the sharp prows of Coast Guard cutters. The air, still thick with the petrichor of the previous night's fury, thrummed with the percussive beat of helicopter rotors. A command post had sprung up at the Saugatuck Harbor, a chaotic ballet of khaki uniforms, crackling radios, and giant maps pinned with the last known coordinates of the Stargazer. It was an impressive display of professional expertise and technological might, a modern world's refusal to accept that two people could simply vanish into the water. Flotillas of civilian boats, spurred by news reports, joined the effort, their owners grim-faced and determined, a maritime militia united by the unwritten law of the water. The scale was staggering, a full-scale military operation waged against an enemy of empty space. The search methodology was a science unto itself, a grim calculus of wind speed, current, and time. Detective Harding, a man whose weary eyes had seen the lake swallow more than its share of souls, explained it to Sarah in the sterile, coffee-scented air of the command post. They had established a search box, a vast rectangle of water based on the Stargazer's last cell phone ping. The cutters and boats moved in precise, overlapping grid patterns, a technique they called a parallel sweep. From the air, helicopters equipped with forward-looking infrared (FLIR) cameras scanned the surface, searching for the heat signature of a human body, a technology brutally effective but rendered nearly useless by the cold, deep waters of the lake. K9 units, dogs trained to detect the specific scent of human decomposition on the water, patrolled the shorelines for miles in either direction, their handlers watching for the subtle cues that might indicate something had washed ashore. But Lake Michigan was a formidable adversary. Its sheer size was incomprehensible, an inland ocean capable of hiding anything. Its currents were complex and unpredictable, a web of underwater rivers that could carry debris for miles in defiance of surface winds. Its depths, plunging to over 900 feet in places, were a cold, dark abyss where sonar signals could be deceiving and recovery was a monumental task. The Army was mighty, but the battlefield was infinite. Miles out from shore, a young Coast Guard seaman named Peterson stood his watch on the bow of the cutter Biscayne Bay. For 8 hours, his world had been reduced to the hypnotic rise and fall of the 3-foot swells and the relentless glare of the sun on the water. The initial adrenaline of the search had long since worn off, replaced by a bone-deep fatigue and the gnawing frustration of the task. The lake was a canvas of deceptive normalcy. He saw floating logs that, for a heart-stopping second, looked like a body. He saw discarded plastic bags that mimicked the color of a life jacket. Each false alarm was a small, sharp stab of disappointment. The water was vast, indifferent. Looking for a man and a little girl here felt less like a search and more like an act of faith. He scanned the horizon, his eyes burning from the strain, the sheer emptiness pressing in on him. It was, he thought, like trying to find two specific grains of sand on a planet made of beaches. The hope that had fueled the morning was slowly being eroded by the vast silent power of the lake itself. Sarah sat on a folding chair at the command post, a styrofoam cup of coffee grown cold in her hands. The air was thick with a language she didn't understand but was beginning to learn. Sea states, drift vectors, search radii. Harding was kind, his voice patient as he showed her the grids on the map, the areas they had cleared, the new zones they were expanding to. She would nod, trying to absorb the information, trying to find a foothold of hope in the clinical precision of it all. But her mind was a maelstrom. She replayed her last conversation with Liam, dissecting every word. She stared at the picture of Maya in the captain's hat until the pixels blurred into a meaningless pattern. She existed in a state of suspended animation, a spectator at her own life's demolition. The constant crackle of the radios was a form of torture, each burst of static a potential harbinger of news she both craved and dreaded. She watched the searchers, their faces etched with a professional focus that felt a world away from the raw, screaming wound in her chest. They were looking for a target, an objective. She was waiting for her world to be returned to her, and with every passing hour, the gulf between their mission and her reality widened into an impassable chasm. On the third day, a shout went up from a volunteer boat. They had found something. A piece of the Stargazer's transom, the distinctive blue and white fiberglass splintered and torn, was spotted bobbing in the waves. On it, the letters Gazer were clearly visible in Liam's hand-painted script. A wave of renewed energy, a jolt of grim optimism surged through the search teams. But there was a problem. The wreckage was found nearly 40 miles north of the northernmost edge of their calculated drift zone. It made no sense. For 3 days, the models had been consistent. Now, this. A new theory quickly took hold, born of desperation and the need for a narrative. The initial storm must have contained a violent, localized microburst, a meteorological hammer blow far more powerful than the general forecast had suggested. It must have struck the Stargazer far to the north of its last known position, before Liam could even send a distress call. The theory was that the boat had been destroyed, capsized, and sunk almost instantly in the deep, trench-like waters of the northern basin. It was a horrifying scenario, but it was an explanation. It explained the lack of a mayday, the location of the wreckage, and the complete absence of any other sign. The false hope it provided was agonizing. It meant Liam and Maya were almost certainly gone, but it also meant they might find them. It offered the cold comfort of closure. The logistical shift was massive. The entire search operation, an armada of vessels and aircraft, was uprooted and moved 40 miles north. The command post was a flurry of new calculations, new maps being printed, new grids being drawn over the deepest parts of the lake. For 4 more days, the teams pursued this new, incorrect path with painstaking diligence. Side-scan sonar vessels, their crews staring intently at monochrome screens, began the laborious process of mapping the lake bed, inch by agonizing inch, searching for the telltale anomaly of a sunken yacht. Divers were put on standby. The emotional toll was immense, the renewed hope making the strain of the search even more acute. Sarah, swept up in the new theory, allowed herself a sliver of that terrible hope. Finding them, even like this, was better than the unending not knowing. The debunking came not with a bang, but with a quiet, devastating report from the forensics lab. A technician examining the transom wreckage found something tangled in a splintered cleat, a length of monofilament line, and a small rusted fishing lure. It was sent for analysis. The report came back on the 7th day of the search. The specific type of lure and line belonged to a commercial fishing trawler that had reported losing a section of its deep water net in that area. The devastating detail was the date the net was lost. 1 week after the stargazer had vanished. The truth fell into place with sickening clarity. The stargazer had likely gone down somewhere in the original search area. Weeks later, a fishing trawler had snagged a piece of the wreckage from the lake bed, dragged it 40 miles north during its operations, and then the piece had broken free to be discovered. They had spent 4 days and millions of dollars searching in the wrong place. The false dawn had broken, revealing nothing but a darker night. The carefully constructed theory collapsed, and with it, the last vestiges of organized hope. The search was officially suspended. The army went home, leaving Sarah alone to face the silent, victorious ghost of the lake. 7 years. The world spun on, seasons turned, and the sharp edges of public memory softened, then eroded completely. But for Sarah Hayes, time had fractured on that stormy Tuesday. Her house was no longer a home, but a meticulously maintained museum of a life that was no longer hers. Maya's room was untouched, a 6-year-old's universe of stuffed animals and picture books frozen under a fine layer of dust. Liam's study still had his geological maps spread on the desk, the world's ancient history a silent mockery of her own arrested timeline. The world had moved on, creating a story to fill the void. The accepted narrative was a somber, cautionary tale told in marinas and yacht clubs along the coast. Liam Hayes, a good man, a competent sailor, had made one fatal miscalculation. He had underestimated the raw, unpredictable power of a great lake. He and his daughter were tragic figures, their names invoked to remind others of their hubris, their bodies given to the cold, fresh water. They were officially declared dead, lost at sea. This false narrative was a stone in Sarah's shoe, a constant, galling irritant. It was neat, it was plausible, and it was, she felt in the deepest marrow of her bones, wrong. She refused to let it settle. While the world grieved and forgot, Sarah fought. Her fight was not loud or public, but a quiet, relentless, all-consuming vigil. After the insurance money came through, she didn't move or renovate. She funneled it into her war against the silence. Her battlefield was the small home office, where, late into the night, fueled by black coffee, she waged her campaign. She had built a website, a digital monument of defiance, findliamandmaya.org. It was a repository of everything, news clippings, search grid maps, Liam's sailing logs, every photo she had of them on the boat. It was a plea and a database, a memorial and an active investigation. She spent thousands on a private investigator, a weary ex-cop who mostly just cashed her checks and re-interviewed people who had nothing new to say. But it was an action, and action was the only antidote to the paralysis of grief. Tonight, her focus was on a single detail. She sat hunched over her laptop, the glow illuminating the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes. She was cross-referencing satellite weather data with a transcript of an old interview with a retired Coast Guard commander. He had mentioned an anomalous radar return during the storm, dismissed at the time as a glitch or a dense flock of birds. On her screen, she had the raw data up, a swirl of green and yellow pixels. She picked up the phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. It rang 4 times before a gruff, sleepy voice answered. Hansen. Commander Hansen, it's Sarah Hayes. A sigh on the other end of the line. Mrs. Hayes, it's almost midnight. The radar anomaly, she said, ignoring the hour. The one at 1947 Zulu time, quadrant Delta 7. You said it looked solid. What does that mean? How is a flock of birds solid? Sarah, we went over this 6 years ago. It was likely a dense rain shaft or a system echo. It's not... Could it have been another boat? She pressed, her voice low and intense. A small boat, without a transponder, running dark in the storm? It's highly unlikely. Nobody would be out in that weather unless they were a fool or... He trailed off. Or they had a reason to be, she finished for him. I'm sending you a link to the raw data. I've enhanced the image. Please, just look at it again. She was relentless, a ghost haunting the periphery of the official record, refusing to let the case be closed, refusing to let her husband and daughter become a simple, tragic story. Her hope had changed over the years. It was no longer the frantic, desperate creature of the initial search. That hope had been a wild bird, beating itself bloody against the cage of reality. This new hope was a different species entirely. It was a low, stubborn pilot light burning deep inside her, a flame that subsisted not on evidence or optimism, but on the sheer, defiant absence of a body. It was a hope born of negative space. Grief was a constant companion, a heavy cloak she wore every day. It was the grief for Liam's laughter, for Maya's small hand in hers, but the fight, the long vigil, was what gave her structure. It was the trellis upon which her shattered life could still grow. To stop fighting would be to accept the story everyone else had written. It would be the second time she lost them. 7 years after the Stargazer vanished, 2 geology graduate students from the University of Michigan, Ben Carter and Chloe Davis, were deep in a remote tract of state forest in the Upper Peninsula. They were miles from any paved road, let alone the vastness of Lake Michigan. Their project was academic, almost esoteric, to map the precise boundaries of a glacial moraine, the rocky debris left behind by retreating ice sheets 10,000 years ago. Ben was lanky and bookish, his passion for stratigraphy matched only by his dislike of mosquitoes. Chloe was practical and athletic, more at home in the field than in a lab. Their world was one of soil horizons and sediment layers, a conversation with deep time. They were working near a peculiar boggy depression, a kettle hole left by a melting chunk of glacier ice. The air was thick with the smell of peat and damp earth. "The soil composition here is all wrong," Ben muttered, kneeling and running the dark, mucky soil through his fingers. "Too much organic matter. It's not consistent with the surrounding till." He decided to take a core sample. He drove his hand auger into the soft ground, twisting it down. About 2 feet in, it struck something hard with a dull, unrock-like thud. "Probably just a big piece of granite," Chloe said, swatting at a black fly on her neck. "Doesn't feel like it," Ben grunted, trying to work the auger around the obstruction. "It's softer." Frustrated, he pulled the auger out and began to dig at the spot with his hands, then with a small trowel from his pack. The soil was soupy and black. He dug for a few minutes, his hands covered in muck, until his fingers brushed against something with a smooth, synthetic texture. He worked his fingers around it, pulling it free from the sucking grip of the bog. It was a bundle of faded, but unmistakably bright, orange fabric. As he lifted it into the dappled sunlight, water and mud streamed from it. It was a child's life jacket. A silence fell over them, thick and immediate. The sounds of the forest, the buzz of insects, the distant call of a loon seemed to recede. Chloe knelt beside him, her eyes wide. The jacket was old, the fabric brittle in places, but it was largely intact. Ben turned it over in his hands. On the back, faded but still perfectly legible, were 5 letters stenciled in black permanent marker. Maya. The name hung in the air between them. They were both from Michigan. They knew the story. The Hayes disappearance was a local legend, a modern ghost story, the father and daughter lost at sea in a violent storm, a tragedy. But that was Lake Michigan. This was here, a dense, nearly inaccessible forest miles and miles inland and significantly uphill from the lake. The discovery made no sense. It was a profound and deeply unsettling contradiction. "This is impossible," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. "How could this get here?" Ben shook his head, his mind racing, trying to find a logical, geological explanation. "A flood? No, there's been no flood event that could carry something this far inland. An animal? A bear? No, it's not torn up enough." The implications began to sink in, cold and terrifying. This wasn't a geological anomaly. This was something else. This piece of the official story, this relic of a lost child, was in the wrong place. And if it was in the wrong place, the whole story might be wrong. Their academic detachment evaporated, replaced by a heavy sense of gravity. They were no longer scientists studying the past. They were custodians of a present-day mystery. Carefully, as if handling unexploded ordnance, they placed the life jacket in a large, sterile sample bag from their kit. They documented the exact location with their GPS, took photos of the site, and then, without another word, packed their gear and began the long, silent hike back to their truck. The forest, which had seemed peaceful and academic an hour before, now felt watchful, menacing. They drove straight to the nearest Michigan State Police barracks, a small, unassuming building in a town of less than 500 people. The trooper at the front desk was young, with a face that hadn't yet acquired the weary cynicism of his profession. He listened to their story, his expression shifting from polite boredom to sharp attention when he saw the name on the life jacket. He didn't know the case personally, but he knew the name. He took the bagged object and their contact information, his movements suddenly deliberate and serious. He told them they had done the right thing. As they left, he picked up his phone to call the district headquarters. The report of the found property was logged, and because of the name, automatically flagged. Within an hour, an email with the case number and a brief summary landed in the inbox of Detective Harding. He was in the cold case unit now, a purgatory for old cops and forgotten crimes. He saw the file number, the Hayes case, and felt a familiar jolt, the ghost of a failure from 7 years ago. He pulled up the location of the discovery on his computer, a satellite map of the Upper Peninsula. He stared at the pin, a tiny red dot in a vast sea of green, miles from the water. A deep, profound sense of wrongness settled over him. The laws of physics, of wind and water and time, had just been broken. The life jacket was handled like a sacred relic, triple-bagged and driven by a state trooper in a climate-controlled vehicle to the Michigan State Police Forensics Laboratory in Lansing. It was delivered to the domain of Dr. Eris Thorne, a man who saw the world not as a collection of objects but as a blizzard of microscopic particles. Thorne was a palynologist, a forensic botanist, and his lab was a temple of sterility and precision. Gleaming stainless steel tables, high-powered scanning electron microscopes, and a hulking, humming gas chromatograph mass spectrometer were his tools. He was a small, neat man with the patient eyes of a watchmaker, and he believed that every object carried a silent microscopic witness on its surface: pollen. Harding had briefed him on the case, on the paradox of the object's location. Thorne's task was to make the life jacket talk, to force it to reveal its journey. His methodology was painstaking. In a clean room wearing a full-body suit, he used fine-tipped tweezers and specialized vacuums to collect samples from every part of the jacket: the outer surface, the inner lining, the deep weave of the straps, and the compressed, mud-caked section that had been buried. Each sample was meticulously labeled and prepared for the microscope. The scientific principle was beautifully simple and devastatingly complex. Every plant produces pollen, and the pollen grains of each species are as unique as fingerprints. These grains are scattered by the wind, creating a pollen rain that is specific to a geographical area and a season. The pollen profile of the open water of Lake Michigan would be dominated by pine, birch, and ragweed from the distant shore. The profile of the remote bog in the Upper Peninsula, however, would be entirely different, rich with the pollen of cedar, black spruce, and, as Thorne quickly discovered, a rare species of bog orchid, Calopogon tuberosus, which grew in that specific acidic soil and almost nowhere else in the state. The pollen was the key. If the jacket had washed ashore and been moved to the bog, it would carry a mix of both profiles. If it had been in the bog for 7 years, the pollen would have penetrated deep into the fibers, and the decay of the material would match that timeline. Under the powerful lens of his microscope, the story began to emerge. The samples from the buried portion of the jacket were, as expected, saturated with the pollens of the bog, including the distinctive kidney bean-shaped grains of Calopogon tuberosus. But as Thorne moved to the samples from the surface, a baffling contradiction appeared. The rare orchid pollen was there, yes, but it was only on the surface. It was resting lightly on the outer weave, caught in the creases, but it had not worked its way deep into the fabric. It was a recent dusting, not a long-term saturation. Then came the second blow. He put a small fiber from the jacket into the mass spectrometer to analyze the polymer degradation. The synthetic nylon and closed-cell foam had been exposed to UV radiation and microbial action, but the level of decay was not consistent with 7 years of exposure. The computer model, based on thousands of similar samples, was unequivocal. The life jacket had been in that outdoor environment for approximately 2 years, maybe 26 months at the outside, not 84. The paradox slammed into Thorne with the force of a physical blow. He leaned back from his microscope, a cold sweat on his brow. The evidence was irrefutable, but it was logically impossible. The life jacket had been in that specific bog, proven by the rare orchid pollen, but it had only been there for about 2 years, yet Maya Hayes had vanished 7 years ago. It couldn't have been there the whole time. It couldn't have washed ashore and been moved there recently, or it would have a mixed pollen signature from the lake environment. It had been kept somewhere else, somewhere protected from the elements for 5 years, and then, about 2 years ago, it had been brought to that bog and partially buried. It was not lost. It was not discarded. It was placed. Detective Harding was at his desk, staring at a mountain of cold case files, when the email from Thorne arrived. The subject line was simply, "Preliminary Report, Hayes Evidence." He opened the attached document and began to read. He read the technical language about polymer chains and pollen strata, and then he got to Thorne's conclusion. He read it once, then a second time, the words rearranging the entire architecture of the case in his mind. The evidence is inconsistent with the object being at the discovery location for the full 7-year duration of the case. The estimated time of environmental exposure is 22 to 26 months. The pollen profile indicates the object was exposed exclusively to the environment of the discovery site, suggesting it was not transported from another outdoor location, for example, the lakeshore. Harding pushed his chair back from his desk, the screech of its wheels loud in the quiet office. The lost at sea narrative, the foundation of the entire case, crumbled into dust. This wasn't a tragic accident, it was a crime scene. Someone had held onto that life jacket for 5 years, and if they had the jacket, Harding thought with a surge of adrenaline that was part hope and part horror, they might have had the girl. The ghost of Maya Hayes, the little girl swallowed by the lake, had just walked out of the water and into the woods, and she might still be alive. The forensic report landed on the conference room table like a grenade. Harding's small cold case team, a young tech-savvy detective named Evans and a seasoned cynical investigator named Rourke, stared at the words on the printout. 2 years, Rourke said, shaking his head. Someone holds onto a kid's life jacket for 5 years, then hikes it into the middle of nowhere and buries it? Why? It's a message, Evans offered, already pulling up satellite maps on the large monitor. Or a mistake, they were discarding it and didn't bury it deep enough. No, Harding said, his voice quiet but firm. This feels different. The location is too specific. A bog. A place that preserves things. A place that also swallows them. This isn't random. He stood and walked to the map, his finger tracing a 10-mile radius around the discovery site. The old theory is dead. Let's work with the new one. Liam and Maya didn't vanish on the water. They were taken from the water. The storm was cover. They were brought to shore somewhere along this remote coastline. The life jacket was placed in that bog 2 years ago. The primary crime scene, the place where they were held, is somewhere inside this circle. The new investigation began not with a massive search, but with a digital excavation. Evans, the database prodigy, started digging. He pulled 7 years of satellite imagery of the search radius, looking for any changes in the dense forest canopy, any new tracks, any signs of life in an area that was supposed to have none. He cross-referenced property records, logging permits, hunting cabin licenses, and even old tax delinquency rolls. They were looking for a needle in a haystack, but now they knew which haystack to search. They weren't looking for people who were supposed to be there. They were looking for a ghost property, a place to disappear. While Evans hunted for digital ghosts, Harding organized a new search of the bog. It wasn't the sprawling, hopeful sweep of 7 years prior. This was a small, specialized team, forensic technicians, an anthropologist, and a geophysicist with a ground-penetrating radar unit. They returned to the exact spot where the life jacket was found. The air once again thick with peat and insects. The atmosphere was different this time. Not one of frustrated hope, but of grim, focused purpose. They weren't looking for a survivor on the surface. They were looking for a crime buried beneath it. For 2 days, the GPR unit was dragged in meticulous, overlapping lines across the soft, damp earth around the discovery site. On the third morning, the geophysicist called Harding over to his monitor. On the screen, a dark, rectangular anomaly appeared about 15 feet from where the jacket had been found. It was a disturbance in the natural stratification of the soil, about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. "It's a pit," the tech said. "Something or someone dug a hole here." A quiet, somber energy fell over the team as they began to excavate. The digging was done with trowels and brushes, the soil sifted and examined. About 4 feet down they found him. The remains were skeletal, but the clothing was partially preserved by the anaerobic conditions of the bog. A man's jacket, jeans. The anthropologist, examining the skull, pointed to a small, neat hole in the occipital bone. "Single gunshot wound to the back of the head," she said, her voice clinical but respectful. It was Liam Hayes, the primary crime scene. The search for the missing sailor was over. The hunt for his murderer had just begun. As the team worked to carefully exhume the remains, a forensic technician processing the area around the body noticed something. Clutched in the skeletal fingers of Liam's right hand, protected from the soil, was a small, tarnished object. He carefully pried it free. It was a silver locket, the kind a man might carry with pictures of his family. But when the technician gently opened the delicate clasp, there was no picture inside. Instead, there was a tiny, folded square of paper, preserved by the locket's seal. With tweezers, he unfolded it. On the brittle paper, written in faint, shaky letters, was a single word: Miller. The name was both a breakthrough and a curse: Miller. In the state of Michigan, it was as common as Smith or Jones. The hunt for the shadow began in the sterile, fluorescent-lit world of databases and public records. Harding's team, now officially a homicide unit, set to work on the monumental task of putting a face to the name. Evans built a complex search algorithm, a digital dragnet. He started with a 50-mile radius from the gravesite and began pulling every Miller who had ever lived there. The list was thousands of names long. The process was a grueling, frustrating slog of elimination. For weeks, they chased ghosts. They investigated a Harold Miller, an elderly hunter with a cabin 20 miles from the bog. But his alibi for the week of the disappearance was ironclad. They looked into a family of Millers with a history of petty crime, but they had been in jail at the time. They interviewed a disgruntled farmer named Miller who had lost his land to the bank. His anger palpable, but his whereabouts accounted for. Each lead was a thread that led nowhere, a door that opened onto an empty room. The pressure from upstairs was mounting. The media had the story of Liam Hayes' discovery, and the narrative had shifted from tragic accident to brutal murder. The public wanted answers. Sarah Hayes, sequestered by the police, was living in a fresh hell. The confirmation of her husband's murder, a new and terrible kind of pain. The breakthrough came from Evans late one night after the rest of the team had gone home. He was chasing a hunch, an idea that felt flimsy but nagged at him. He had been focusing on Millers who lived near the grave. What if he was looking in the wrong place? What if the connection wasn't to the destination but to the origin? He rewrote his search query. He wanted a list of any individual named Miller who had been employed by or had a contract with the Saugatuck Marina where Liam Hayes had kept the Stargazer. He cross-referenced that list with property owners within the 100-mile search radius around the gravesite. He expected dozens of hits, or more likely none at all. He hit enter. The computer whirred for a moment, and then a single line of text appeared on his screen. Frank Miller. Employed as a mechanic at Saugatuck Harbor Marina from 2005 to 2012. Employment terminated 2 months before the disappearance of Liam and Maya Hayes. Reason: downsizing. Cross-referencing property records, Evans found that in 2009, Frank Miller and his wife, Brenda Miller, had purchased a 40-acre parcel of undeveloped, heavily wooded land in the Upper Peninsula. The property was located just 4.3 miles from the bog where Liam Hayes' body was found. Evans's heart began to pound. He kept digging. A search of firearms registries showed no weapons registered to Frank Miller, but a deeper search, a statewide query of all purchases, flagged a sale from a gun shop in Marquette. 1 month before the disappearance, Brenda Miller had purchased a .22 caliber rifle, the same caliber as the bullet the ME had suggested was the likely murder weapon. It all clicked into place, a horrifying, perfect mosaic. The file they built over the next 48 hours was a portrait of quiet desperation. Frank Miller, 48, was a skilled marine mechanic, a man who had worked with his hands his whole life. Losing his job had been more than a financial blow, it was an existential one. Brenda Miller, 46, had a medical history that was a litany of heartbreak. 3 documented miscarriages, followed by a diagnosis of early menopause. Her medical records noted severe depression. They had sold their modest suburban home near Saugatuck a year after Frank lost his job, severing their last ties to their old life and moving permanently to the remote, isolated property in the woods. They were financially broken, socially isolated, and consumed by a grief that had curdled into something monstrous. Their motive wasn't money. It was a twisted, pathological replacement. They didn't want to steal a fortune. They wanted to steal a child. The convoy of 3 unmarked sedans moved slowly down the long, muddy track, the tires churning through ruts deep enough to swallow a small car. The woods pressed in on either side, a dense wall of pine and birch that blotted out the sky. After a mile, the track opened into a small, scraggly clearing. In the center stood a rundown cabin, more of a shack, with a crooked porch and a thin plume of gray smoke rising from a rusty tin chimney. A man was in the yard splitting firewood. He was thick-set, with a grizzled beard and the weary, stooped shoulders of someone who had been carrying a heavy weight for a very long time. It was Frank Miller. He looked up as the first car pulled into the clearing, the axe freezing mid-swing. He didn't look surprised or scared. He looked resigned, as if he had been expecting them for 7 years. Harding got out of his car, flanked by Rourke and Evans. He kept his hands visible, his movements slow. "Frank Miller?" he called out, his voice carrying in the still, cold air. The man just nodded, letting the axe fall to the ground with a soft thud. He didn't run. He didn't speak. He just watched them approach, his face a mask of profound, soul-deep exhaustion. Harding stopped 10 feet from him. "My name is Detective Harding. We found Liam Hayes." The words seemed to break something inside Frank Miller. His body sagged, the last bit of tension draining out of him, and he collapsed onto his knees in the dirt. The confession came not as a trickle, but as a flood, a torrent of words pouring out of him as if a dam had burst. He wept great, shuddering sobs as he told them everything. He spoke of the bitterness of losing his job, of watching the wealthy boat owners like Liam Hayes sail away on their perfect lives while his own fell apart. He told them how he used his intimate knowledge of the marina's security blind spots and Liam's routines. He had sabotaged the Stargazer's radio antenna before they left port. He had followed them out onto the lake in his own small, unregistered fishing boat, a ghost in their wake. When the storm he had been waiting for hit, he used the chaos, the high waves, and driving rain to pull alongside. He boarded their yacht, a gun in his hand, his face covered. He described Liam's shock, his desperate attempt to protect his daughter. He forced Liam to pilot the boat to a secluded, rocky shore on his own property. He marched him into the woods to the bog and shot him in the back of the head. He and Brenda had taken Maya. They had brought her back to the cabin. The whole story, the solution to the 7-year mystery of Liam Hayes, spilled out of him in a raw, pathetic heap. The case was solved. There was a grim, sickening sense of resolution in the cold air. Harding listened to it all, his face impassive, recording every word. Rourke and the other officers were quietly securing the cabin, where they found Brenda Miller sitting catatonically at a kitchen table. It was over. Harding looked down at the broken man kneeling in the mud. "It's over, Frank," he said, his voice devoid of triumph, only weariness. "We found Liam. We know what you did. Just tell me one more thing. What happened to the little girl? Where's Maya?" Frank Miller looked up, his face a mess of tears and dirt. He didn't say a word. He just lifted a trembling hand and jerked his head toward the back of the property, toward a small, dilapidated barn whose roof was sagging in the middle. From within the dark structure, Harding heard a faint, rhythmic sound, a soft, metallic rattling. The sound sent a spear of ice through his veins. He looked at Rourke, his eyes wide with a dawning, unspeakable horror. He and 2 other officers drew their weapons and moved toward the barn, their boots sinking into the soft mud. Harding pushed the heavy, creaking door open. The interior was dark and smelled of hay and ammonia and something else, something stale and human. As his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he saw it. Hanging from a thick central beam by a heavy, rust-pitted chain was a large, crude cage, welded together from rebar and sheet metal. And inside the cage, huddled on a pile of filthy blankets, was a girl. She was pale and painfully thin, her dark hair lank and greasy, her clothes little more than rags. She looked up at the sudden intrusion of light, her eyes wide and dark, and filled with a terror so profound it seemed to have burned away every other emotion. It was Maya. She was 13 years old, and she was alive. The shock was absolute, a physical blow that staggered Harding, a revelation so monstrous it eclipsed everything that had come before it. The rattling sound had been the cage, swaying slightly on its chain. The scene in the barn was one of hushed, horrified reverence. An officer used a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters on the thick chain, the snap of the metal echoing like a gunshot in the silent structure. The cage fell the last few inches to the dirt floor with a heavy clang. Maya didn't move. She just stared, her body coiled into a tight ball. A female officer, a trained crisis negotiator, approached slowly, speaking in a low, soothing voice. She opened the cage door. It took 10 minutes to coax Maya out. She was not just malnourished, she was feral, a creature who had known nothing but this 6-by-4-foot world for more than half her life. She flinched from human touch, her breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. The journey out of the woods was a silent, funereal procession. Maya was wrapped in a blanket in the back of an ambulance, a paramedic sitting with her, not touching her, just being a quiet presence. The reunion with her mother was not a cinematic embrace. Sarah, rushed to the hospital, saw not the 6-year-old from her memory, but a haunted skeletal stranger with her daughter's eyes. When she reached for her, Maya screamed, a raw animal sound of pure terror, and recoiled. Sarah pulled her hand back as if she'd been burned, a new, unimaginable agony tearing through her. She had gotten her daughter back, but the child she had lost was gone forever. The legal fate of Frank and Brenda Miller was swift and absolute. Faced with the irrefutable evidence and their own confessions, they offered no defense. They were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of Liam Hayes and the kidnapping and imprisonment of Maya Hayes. They disappeared into the correctional system, their monstrous act reduced to a few lines in a court ledger, and the world moved on. For Sarah and Maya, however, the end of the trial was the beginning of the real ordeal. Their life became a landscape of therapy appointments, medical checkups, and the painstaking, exhausting work of reclamation. Maya was a ghost in her own home. She had no memory of her life before the cage, no recollection of her father, no recognition of the woman who was her mother. The world was a terrifying cacophony of new sounds, new smells, new spaces. She had to be taught how to use a fork, how to sleep in a bed, how to exist in a room without walls of rebar. Sarah found herself grieving on two fronts, mourning the husband whose body she had finally laid to rest, and mourning the laughing, bright-eyed 6-year-old who had been stolen from her. In her place was this traumatized 13-year-old, a stranger she loved with a fierce, desperate ache, but whom she did not know. The victory of finding Maya alive was a daily battle, fought against the deep and terrible wounds of her captivity. A year later, Sarah and Maya were sitting on a park bench. It was a crisp autumn day, and leaves were skittering across the pavement. Maya was still thin, still quiet, but the hollowed-out look in her eyes had been replaced by a guarded watchfulness. She rarely spoke in full sentences, but she spoke. A woman walked by with a golden retriever, and the dog bounded over to them, its tail wagging. Maya, who had initially been terrified of all animals, watched it. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of her lips. She reached out a hesitant hand and let her fingers brush against the dog's soft fur. "Soft," she whispered, the single word a monumental victory. Sarah watched the interaction, her heart a complex, aching knot of love, grief, and exhaustion. She had her daughter back. This was the truth. But the truth was not an ending. It was not a neatly wrapped resolution. Justice had been served, the monster caged, but healing was a longer, harder, and far more complicated journey. It was a long walk home, a path they had to forge themselves, one fragile step at a time through the vast, silent wilderness of what came after.